Evening, everyone. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Oh, you are very welcome. We're right at the beginning of our fall season, so sign up for our mailing list so you don't miss anything great. The Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction, and we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, and our Emerging Writing Fellowship, to name a few ways that we do it. Thank you for coming tonight. We're also thrilled to partner tonight with the Bellevue Literary Review. The Bellevue Literary Review is an award-winning literary journal that has been illuminating the human condition through the prism of health, illness, and healing for more than 20 years. A couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started. The cafe and bar will be serving until 8:30, and drinks are allowed in here. We will have an audience Q&A, and when it's time to go to questions, if you would raise your hand, somebody will bring you a microphone. That's because we have a lot of people who are watching on a live stream as well. They can hear your question too. And if you're watching on the live stream, you can type your question in the chat at any time. When the event is over, the books are available for sale at the bookstore counter, and they are already signed, but you're welcome to stay and get them personalized if you like. We'll do that just on the other side of this wall. All right, now let me do one thing first. Okay, let me introduce our guests. Jayne Ann Phillips is the author of Black Tickets, Machine Dreams, Fast Lanes, Shelter, Motherkind, Lark, and Termite, and Quiet Dell. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Bunting Fellowship, and 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. Winner of an Arts and Letters Award and the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She was inducted into the Academy in 2018. A National Book Award finalist and twice a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She lives in New York and Boston, and I'll say this book that we're celebrating tonight has been long listed for the National Book Award this year. Danielle Ofri, MD, PhD, is one of the foremost voices in the medical world today. She's a primary care internist at Bellevue Hospital and clinical professor of medicine at NYU, as well as the founder and editor-in-chief of the Bellevue Literary Review. And her writing appears in the New Yorker, the New York Times, and the Atlantic, as well as in the Lancet and NEJM, I'm guessing New England Journal of Medicine. She has given several TED Talks and performed at the Moth, and is the author of 6 books about life and medicine. Her latest is When We Do Harm, A Doctor Confronts Medical Error. Please welcome them both to the stage.
I hope you don't mind if I take your picture. While she's taking the picture, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us at the Center for Fiction and at Bellevue Literary Review. We're really thrilled to be partnering on this. I just want to keep my doctor hat on first, remind us all that the COVID cases are indeed rising, hospitalizations. So if you have a mask and want to wear it, it's appreciated by the people on stage. Given that Jayne Ann's book was just longlisted for the National Book Award, she's going to be very busy. We don't want to get her sick. And that it's flu season, and starting this week, you should get your flu shot, your COVID booster, 1 in each arm, same time, please. And if you're over 60, RSV. HIV testing while you're there, but we'll leave that for another one.
Separately for the RSV?
2 weeks gap for RSV. But I would prioritize the COVID booster, which, as you know, has been retooled for the new variants, and your flu, which you get at the same time. Shingrix, you can wait on that one. We gave you one of our copies of BLR. Please take it if you want. I put 2 things in there. One is just a little invitation to subscribe. Literary magazines are how most writers get their start, probably including Jayne Ann as well. And there's a 15% off there. We did do a rush shipment to get a postcard for Taking Care, our Symphony Space live storytelling event. Tickets went on sale, sold down 24 hours before I even got here with these, but there will likely be live stream options, so you can go to Symphony Space and come join us. So we're so thrilled, I am so thrilled, to be talking to Jayne and Phillips about this wonderful book, Night Watch, which I read in about a weekend at max. It was really great.
That's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, no, it's a great, fun, it's a great narrative book. It's a great book to be at the Center for Fiction, which, by the way, I learned today, also stocks nonfiction. I was shocked to see one of my books there, but yes, they sell nonfiction too, and poetry, I believe, as well. So, but nothing like a good novel to like get in, get down, and just really, get into it. And this is such an interesting book, because it covers so many different things and uses different lenses. And I'm wondering, especially as a nonfiction writer, how do you angle yourself into a book like this one? Like, did you stumble across this history somewhere in reading? Was there like a character buzzing in your head? Was something in your family history or a theme you always want to know about? Or some personal history you want to mind? How do you get into a book like this?
Well, I think you do research constantly, but it's kind of a osmosis that you're just soaking in things without really knowing that you're remembering them for any particular reason.
Okay.
My hometown in West Virginia was 20 minutes from the Weston State Asylum, as it was called then. But of course, it was started in 1859 or so in Western Virginia. And it is a real marvel. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I was also aware that I'm old enough that my grandfathers were born just 20 years after the Civil War. So it would have been their constant point of reference. In terms of how I get into a book, it's always language. And I entered the book, I'd been thinking about the asylum, but I entered the book through the beginning of the book. Many times the beginning of the book ends up on page 200, but this book really starts out with Connolly's voice. She's a 12-year-old girl. It starts on April 2nd, 1874, and she sort of led me into the book. I have no idea when I start a book where the book is going necessarily. I didn't really have it planned out. It just, she sort of presented this situation.
And how did you find this character?
How did I find the character?
Yeah, Connolly. How did you find her?
She found me, I guess. It's just a voice, I just sort of heard her voice. And she's the only first-person narrator in the book.
Which we'll definitely talk about. I'm intrigued by the narrators, and if you haven't read the book yet, it's sort of...
Right, we try not to do spoilers, but...
No spoilers, but the opening of the book, which is sort of like the opening to the novel as well as the opening literally of the book, is Connolly's approach to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It's not a spoiler. And maybe you could just read a little bit, just as they're approaching what will be the story, and of course, our story as the readers.
Okay.
A little bit from like page 17.
So I've cut a lot of things out because I wanted these readings to be quick. But it is June 1874, 10 years after the Civil War. Connolly is a 12-year-old girl. Her mother hasn't spoken for over a year, and we find out why in the book. One day, the man Connolly has been told to call Papa comes home with a trunk of fancy women's clothes. He immediately has a neighbor woman in to dress Connolly's mother in these clothes, and then he's quickly giving away the 3 babies that she's had since he's been at their home. He puts Connolly and her mama into the buckboard, and he says that they're going for her rest and cure at the asylum. Connolly, night watch. She's astounded when he leaves her there with her mother. And I better not, I won't spoil that. Night watch, Connolly. I wished so hard we'd arrived at night when no one could see us for me to think on our situation, but the sky had lightened and there was no time. I hoisted Mama's carpet bag and took her arm. We walked slowly along the gravel path. Miss Janet, I said. Father has told her to call her Miss Janet and not reveal that she's a daughter, but a maidservant. Miss Janet, I said, we'll stop at this place to break our journey. Many stop here to rest. I hope to stay near you. She lifted her skirts a bit in the front, like any lady would on a walk that wasn't paved. We came to the circular pool, and Mama turned to walk round it rather than going on. A black iron pedestal held the fountain aloft. Water bubbled in a spray, spilling from fountain to pedestal to pool. I turned to move on, but Mama had sat down on a wrought iron bench. I sat beside her, wondering if anyone was watching. There was no use asking her about Papa if it was true, or lies that had to do with too many infants and winter coming on. We didn't live in sight of any neighbors, and the small farms deep in the ridges were deserted regular in the war years. We'd no relatives I knew of, and only Dervla for family. We lived in Virginia, but now we were not Virginia. I knew from Papa that the name of our state had changed more than once, that West Virginia had betrayed the South and stood for the Union. If Papa was for the South, I was for the Union, and Mama was surely with me, even if she valued the flow blue plate that showed Charleston's South Carolina harbor. It hung above the iron sink in a wire frame. Give away now, like everything else. I could not bring myself to pull the bell cord and wake anyone, but I stood Mama just beside me and knocked. My hand seemed a crumpled moth on the huge black door, tapping, tapping again. But I was only whispering to one who must have seen us, the person or persons on night duty. Surely that person must let us in or turn us away. I felt Mama reach for me and put my arm about her waist. She was wore out, up from bed so seldom and confined in the rattling, bumping buckboard almost 2 days, to sit or lie in the sun or the dark, always tied at the ankle lest she might flee or resist. Perhaps she'd sat down before the fountain, unable to walk farther. The thought so frightened me that I knocked again and did not stop knocking. But I heard the sound of locks opening and bolts sliding, and the door half opened. A tall man, broad in the shoulders, stood looking down at us. He was dressed almost like a train conductor, all in black, and his cap was round with a round bill. He wore a patch that covered his left eye from brow to cheekbone with a livid scar beneath. It was not so fearful or unusual then, especially in the towns, to see the bandaged or the maimed. They weren't able-bodied and couldn't go back to the farms. So many amputees and injured soldiers from the war, most of them young, survived wounds that killed older men. I could not tell if this man was young. Everyone seemed old to me, and I counted myself among them. My mother was past her 30th year, and I was more like her sister these years past than her daughter. Papa would call me the old biddy, and her the fairy queen. I made my voice steady. "Good day," I said. "I've brought Miss Janet for her rest and cure." "The staff does not receive at this hour," he said. "You must come back after 9. "Sir, I'm sorry for the early hour, but we've traveled such a way." I felt myself thrown forward then, for my mother had fallen against me with all her weight. I was half in the entrance, my ribs hard against the marble doorstep, and felt him lift her from me as the door swung wide. He pulled me to my feet with one hand as he shut the door behind us and threw the bolt into place. Then he was carrying her across the round, empty room, so vast it seemed, as though she was a child. I ran after them with her carpet bag. "She's faint," I was saying. "We've not had much to eat or drink." He'd stopped, though, and put her on a chaise and taken a vial from his pocket. "Hartshorn spirits," he said, "ammoniac to revive her." He took the small cork from the vial and held it to her nose. She started and drew in her breath, gasping, and opened her eyes on his face that was close to hers. Her gaze widened as though she knew him. Of course she didn't, but I was grateful she didn't call out or seem afraid. I saw now that his eye patch wasn't made of cloth, but of something harder, rounded tin or metal covered with felt, held in place with straps. A scar like an angry bloom was on his temple and disappeared under his cap and shaggy black hair. But she seemed to sense a sudden protection or counsel. Then he stepped back and she looked wildly around as though she'd no memory of how we arrived at such a place. I reached down to grasp her shoulder. "Miss Janet," I remembered to say, "you were faint. We've come to the asylum for your rest." "I'll call the matron," said our benefactor. The cooks are not in, but I've some vigils set out. I'm O'Shea, the night watch. Can you walk, miss? He looked at me when she didn't answer. Girl, he said, if you'll bring her. And he turned on his heel. We crossed the wide floor. Our shoes, Mama's and mine, clicked on the marble floor. His footsteps were silent, and such a big man. Then I saw that he'd thick woolen covers tied over his boots.
That is the beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is the trickle into the novel, into the story, into Connolly's life, into Miss Janet's life, which will take you in paths that you will not be able to predict. That I promise you. And we will not reveal any of the spoilers. But it's interesting how many novels sort of begin with a journey. Right? They say almost every novel just is a journey. Someone goes to town, someone leaves town. That's every novel. And it has a few obstacles in the way. But it is a great way to begin. And what's interesting is this is historical fiction, which fascinates me as a writer and a reader, because it's kind of a hybrid of fiction and nonfiction. But fiction and nonfiction have very different contracts with the reader. Right? The fiction contract is disbelief, and the nonfiction contract is facts and truth. And yet historical fiction kind of combines them. And so I'm wondering, how do you meld these two contracts so the reader feels fulfilled and not cheated on either one?
I really don't think of this book or my other books as historical fiction.
Why not?
Because, well, she's going to challenge me on this.
It's fiction. It's set in a time.
I feel as though nonfiction, the main allegiance is to an event or an era or something that happened, and the characters help the reader gain access into those things. But I feel as though my books are really totally character-driven. And if this is historical fiction, so was Lark and Termite, so was Shelter, so was Machine Dreams, because in each of them there's something that ties the book together. So it's as though their characters are moving in this atmosphere, like the fiction, the history is the river that everything is sort of moving along in.
I guess I think of historical fiction as having an outsized sense of place and time. Often many wonderful books of fiction take place wherever. It's a family, and it doesn't. The place and time are less important. It could, in some ways, be timeless. But some books are inherently dependent on place and time, and of course, this would be, because you couldn't set this not in the Civil War. Right? It wouldn't work around the Vietnam War because of what's unique about these characters and what drives them. Their histories is so tied to that. So, which is why it strikes me as historical fiction, and not in the sort of negative connotation. Oh, we're just doing a little bodice ripper somewhere in another time, but in the fact that the time and the place are characters. Would you see the Civil War as a character?
I think that's totally true, but I think it's true in all of my books that the time and the place are very much characters. I grew up in West Virginia, and not all of my books, but a lot of them have some connect to that. And I feel, too, that, history gives us the facts, but literature tells us the story, which could be true in a nonfiction book as well. In other words, the characters sort of access the meaning of history for us. History is often written by the victor, right? And sometimes you can't trust that story. And I think it's increasingly so that we need to take a closer look at fiction and nonfiction as ways into what is happening now.
Right. It's sort of when people do documentaries that are sort of docudramas, which is, we take a time and place and look for those stories. West Virginia is a very contested historically area. How does that play a role in your evolution as a writer?
Well, West Virginia is really just such a part of my imagination. And it's always bothered me that educated Americans don't know that West Virginia seceded from Virginia. So I think I want to make that very clear in this book. Because it has always been a border state. And until, I mean, when I was growing up, my parents voted the straight Democratic ticket. You know, it's a very special place, and it's a place, and I loved being able to write about it before it would have changed, you know, 150 years ago.
What's interesting about what you just said, though, to be a border state, I mean, that's where the heart of a great story is. The border state psychologically,
time, yeah.
but physically, psychologically at a border state. I mean, what if you didn't have a border state, you wouldn't have a plot of any great, you know, novel or story, because you need to have that contrast and conflict of being at a border that is never quite settled. So it's very intriguing.
And I think it's true of the individuals too. They're never quite settled. I mean, we all have this kind of crossing borders inside ourselves as we get older. And the word story is really important. I feel like story is about perception and how people think and how they think about the past and the present and the future kind of simultaneously sometimes. And so lucky for me that Thomas Story Kirkbride, his middle name is Story. I mean, it's those kinds of strange things always happen. But as Papa leaves them at the asylum, he sort of calls back this taunt to Connolly, and he says, "Times is hard. You'll tell the story," as he's driving off. And she does tell the story. And there are other narrators that are close third person, I would say, who tell their own story. And they just sort of lie over one another like a braid.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, story is how we organize history. Right? You can't memorize all the facts of history, but you can learn the stories because they inherently make more sense. And I'm always intrigued. You know, at Bellevue Literary Review, we get thousands of submissions a year, and many of them you can tell on page one, paragraph, sentence one, that this is not going to make it. And usually why it is not going to make it is because the sense of story is directly linear. It's just a ploddingly, we did this, then we did that, we did that, which is how often a first draft of a story is, but that's not how we think or feel. And if you ever want to have some fun, take a great short story or a short novel like Saturday by Ian McEwan and plot it out. And it's never linear. And not only not linear, it's not evenly paced. You know, there'll be a paragraph that covers 200 years and then 200 pages that will, you know, cover a moment. You know, Atonement is like that. And it's really interesting. Or Arundhati Roy's book, The God of Small Things. She was an architect before she was a writer, and you can see it in the writing, in the way the story is structured. But the reason it feels so natural to us is because that's how we live. We live moving in time, but we're remembering, we're thinking forward, and the story is
I
always
feel
a
as
mix.
though fiction is really a form of time travel. You know, it's a way for us to enter other eras, other places, other consciousnesses.
And take some risks.
And take some risks. I mean, I know that I actually mapped out Fat City several times. This is a novel about boxing, which I really don't care much about. And it's set in Sacramento, California, in the 50s. But it is written so perfectly. And I think there may have been one or two other books that I mapped out like that. I wouldn't want anyone to map this book out because that would be very difficult.
So let's talk about the reasons for admission, 1864 to 1889, on page 172. Now, as a physician, I found these astounding, edifying, horrifying, and amusing all at once. And this is, did you just copy this out of a page? Tell us what this is.
This is the reasons for admission at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum from 1864 to 1889. And it was in a couple of reference books that I read about the asylum.
Can you read us a few?
I'm going to read you a few.
You can read them all.
It's very.
It's a great story.
It's very aware of self-pleasure, let's say. Okay, kicked in the head by a horse. Imaginary female trouble. Hysteria. marriage of son, minstrel deranged, novel reading, nymphomania, and then we have several masturbation and syphilis, masturbation for 30 years, medicine to prevent conception could be a cause for insanity. And then there are the really sad ones, like death of sons in war, decoyed into the army, or simply the war.
They're just amazing. They go on, and I encourage you to read them. And you know, it's funny because whenever I just spent the day in clinic at Bellevue, and you can't close out a note until you choose a diagnosis. And you must give someone a label, and there's no getting around it. Insurance reasons, electronic medical record reasons, and just the way we function in medicine. But sometimes it's hard. You know, I saw a young man today, and he didn't really have a diagnosis. And you can't just put, you know, just someone struggling to live. You know, that does not count on there, but it would be a great one because that is what a lot of people are coming, you know, seeking help with. But I thought about that list, and there's some just great ones in there that were just intriguing. And so let's turn from diagnosis to treatment. And on page 149, I'll have you read a little bit because I was so taken by the treatment regimen that was laid out for Miss Janet. And it's, you know, it's very sort of historical and ancient, and yet it feels so modern and necessary. I'm thinking, I want a little more of that. So maybe you can read just a bit of that from page 149, and then maybe tell us how and why this treatment plan came to be.
Well, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride was a Quaker from Pennsylvania, and he was the head physician of the first kind of more modern treatment for the mentally ill at the Pennsylvania State Hospital. And he published in 1852 it was, a really seminal work that was called On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. And this book of his was incredibly influential for about 50 years. And it was down to the nail and down to the cut limestone of these buildings, everything completely detailed, how to avoid fire, how to avoid this, how to avoid that. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was 10 miles of space inside. The buildings, when completed, went on for a quarter of a mile, and there were over 300 acres on which they were all self-sustaining. They were meant to grow their own food. They had their own dairies. They had gardens. And they had walking trails that were segregated for men and women that went way up into the hills.
Can I ask just a quick question? Mm-hmm. Who paid for this? Who funded such a beautiful, luxurious space?
Each state. I start the book out with this quote from Kirkbride. The simple claims of a common humanity should induce each state to make a liberal provision for all its insane, especially as regards the poor. So he sort of started this movement that every state then made a large institution built according to his principles. And it was very important to his method of treatment that everyone have their own room with 2 large windows and a transom over the door. And their regimen might be different for each person, but basically they came out for breakfast and their rooms were locked because they were going to be out doing things all day. A walk of 4 or 5 miles. Well, I get into that here, so I'll just start reading. Connolly has gotten to the institution, and Dr. Story, who is a nephew of the great man, as he's called in this book, is talking with her. And Miss Janet has no family, Dr. Story asked, no children. She has no children, I managed to say. Far as I know, no one mentioned such. She was always called Miss Janet. It may be she was betrothed, but so many went to the war. He interrupted me. Miss Connolly, There is clearly a bond between you. I would like to employ you as Miss Janet's attendant to share her room and look after her. Accompany her on her assigned regimen, but I can pay you only in room and board for present until we can ascertain your continued positive effect. Dr. Story, I told him, I want to stay very much. On a trial basis, he said. This must be understood. You see, Miss Connolly, books are all very well. Miss Janet and I will certainly discuss books. He nodded at Mama. But a strict regimen, including physical activity, a walk of some 3 to 5 miles a day, croquet, hoops on the lawn, carriage rides in late afternoon, is essential. For women, sewing, embroidery, sketching, and pastels, simply for expression, for pleasure. I nodded, wondering if he would discover who my mother really was. I did not know truth from memory myself anymore. She'd shot deer and killed and dressed them, always with dervla. I remembered them working in brimmed hats, leather gloves to their elbows, pulling and cutting, the slide of steaming guts tumbling out on the ground, and the carcasses hung up. I heard the crack of a rifle in the woods, a thud of running and scuffling near my hiding place, smelled the earth of the root cellar. But Dr. Story was speaking. His voice gathered me in. You will see, Miss Connolly, he said, we provide firm, sympathetic structure, healthy air and food, a refuge from family and strife. Our approach is known as moral treatment. Many can be cured with humane treatment, and the incurable treated humanely. It seemed a riddle, but the interview was over.
Now, I found that amazing. I can think of a lot of people who could use a little time in a place like that with long walks and engaging discussions over books and a rest from your family and humanity. Again, like, how did he get states to pay for that, or the government, the communal society? We don't get it now. You can't get a therapist in New York City if you sell your firstborn kid. You can't get psychiatric treatment.
Well, now the population is around 332 million. And at that time, the population was 30 million. And there was this idea of a contract, and perhaps once each state began to build them, each state needed to build one. And there was a lot of land, and this lunatic asylum in particular, Trans-Allegheny, Virginia had given the land to what they called the Western Frontier. It was the first big allowance of funds ever given to West Virginia by Virginia. And just a year after the first building was erected, the war broke out, and the North hustled to Weston and stole all the money that was supposed to be for the completion of the asylum. And then during the war, it was a camp called Union Camp, and the whole great lawn was covered with tents. To
me, it's fascinating that it was just prioritized so highly in society, both financially and morally, which is quite different from today. I mean, I look at, in the old parts of Bellevue, there are these old, areas with transoms, high ceilings, and even little terraces to take in the air. It would be nice.
This was a time when there were no drugs. He did not believe in restraining people. If someone was violent, they'd be put in a far wing into what is basically an empty room until they could regain more control.
It's fascinating because that really did change quite a bit. You mentioned briefly, and this is not giving anything away, that Connolly kind of becomes Miss Janet's nurse to some degree. And there's a scene on page 159 when she looks in the mirror, she puts on her uniform, nursing uniform for the first time, and she says, "It struck me silent." And I was really taken by that because uniforms play an incredibly big role in medicine. We have white coat ceremonies now where medical students, are given their first white coat, and there's a hierarchy, right? There's medical students, you can tell the medical toddlers because they have little short white coats, and interns have long ones, but it has a different thing, and attending physicians have a different kind of coat, and it makes a real difference. In nursing uniforms, you could tell our old BLR covers before these had historical photos, and so the Bellevue nurses had the coffee filters on their heads, and the St. Vincent nurses had like the triangle ones on their heads, and there was still, when I was in medical school, there was still one nurse left who wore her coffee filter on her head. But it was a part of your nursing school where you came from. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the role of clothing and uniforms for people in your book, the characters, what it means for them, and also what research you had to do in order to figure out what people wore.
Well, the research covered everything from the rifles to the uniforms to medicines that people would have had access to, because there weren't really that many doctors, and the population was overwhelmingly rural, and everyone kind of knew a certain bit about how to find herbs and plants that would construct a kind of medical treatment. But Conna Lee in that moment, her mother is needing to learn to speak again and to feel safe. Conna Lee is just agog when she first arrives. And when she puts on that uniform, she's suddenly has a defined person. Later on, the uniform becomes not so important. Oh, I could do such a good spoiler right now.
Don't.
But there's a point in the book, there's a kind of melee happening, and she actually throws off her nurse's hat and pulls her hair out to distinguish herself from the asylum.
And I feel like these uniforms are also give us a certain amount of, I would say, protection. But it's interesting if I walk in, I've always wondered if I went to visit someone in another hospital, if I put on a white coat, I could just walk right in, right? So, look, there's another doctor, like we all kind of look the same. And but it's strange how that gives you this sort of armor to a little bit. And it's just, and it has an effect on other people, for good or for bad. I'm not necessarily saying it's the right thing. And, there's a long time when I shunned the white coat. But then you just need pockets. White coats have pockets. But there is something that,
And they seem clean.
That is the operative word. All right. And in fact, white coats do carry quite a bit of germs and things.
And
so
think
do those
about
ties that men
policemen's uniforms.
Yeah.
And ministers' clothing. They're so much defined by this, yet we can't really tell who they are.
Right, it's just a piece of clothing. I just find that fascinating. I was wondering, why does war intrigue you so much? Why are we set there? And I'm thinking, and maybe you could read a little bit from the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864. It's a fascinating and horrible war, but it seems to intrigue you either as a writer or as a person. And what makes you want to set a novel around a war?
War sort of stops our lives completely, if it's taking place in our land, certainly. And this book really, for me, is the third of a trilogy. The first one being Machine Dreams, which was about the Vietnam War. The second being Lark and Termite, which was based on something that actually happened in the Korean War. And now this book going a little further back. Those wars were different because they took place elsewhere, but the Civil War took place here. I think once war descends, it cancels everyone's lives and writes its own history. And the Civil War casts a shadow today. I think there are other artists than myself writing about the Civil War or thinking about the Civil War, because we find ourselves in a time of migrating populations, families separated, a lot of political violence, entrenched points of view that dehumanize the other point of view. And that was certainly what happened in the lead up and in the years after the Civil War. But all of that becomes secondary very quickly if you're a soldier. And this is a moment from the Battle of the Wilderness, which happened in May of 1864. The battlefield was a really scrubby, several acres of forest. And the trees were kind of this big around, so thick that a man could not walk through except sideways. So it had to be hand-to-hand combat. And finally, toward the end of the day, there was so much gunpowder in the air that everything caught on fire. 29,000 died on both sides. But this is where our character finds himself in this battle, even though he's been a sharpshooter earlier in the war. Fires lit throughout the wilderness, and pinnacles of flame shot skyward. The sharpshooter, his hair and brows singed, fell back enough to glimpse an isolated enemy swarm flail forward around the flaming breastworks, finishing off the men they'd injured, gaining the ground. Men screamed, cut off from any escape. Blazes leapt tree to tree, crackling, whistling shrill, otherworldly sounds. There's a siren. A soldier in Union blue, wounded in both legs, rolled away from the flames, even as fire pursued him along the ground. The sharpshooter laid down his weapon and ran forward, pulling the man over his shoulder in one motion. They turned, and he heard the man say, "Brother." A rebel, his grimacing face covered in black soot, took hold of them both and plunged a knife so deep into the wounded man's back that the sharpshooter felt the blow. Life went out of his burden, and the sharpshooter grasped the knife and pulled it out, reversing its trajectory full force and plunging it into the throat of their assailant. The Confederate gurgled blood, grasping desperately and bringing them all down. Brush behind the breastworks now lit in a broad crescent. Flames doubled in height as fire raced up the trees in whirling pieces. The sharpshooter pushed his assailant aside and was struggling to his feet, still holding the body of his fellow, when a shell exploded nearby, throwing up earth and rock with tremendous velocity. A stone the size of his head struck his left temple, a glancing blow, and broke his skull. He fell back unconscious as the spattered stone ricocheted into a gully. Sparks flung themselves eagerly over him, igniting a new existence in which he would not know himself, nor this moment, nor the coming weeks that followed. Two soldiers in retreat ripped off his burning clothes and rolled him naked onto a tent canvas. They were Union sharpshooters and strong men, for they pierced the heavy canvas with their bayonets, pressed the stocks of their rifles flat together, and carried him slung from the long barrels of their guns. His weight pulled the canvas into a tight U shape, and his head wound turned it red with blood that stiffened the fabric still more. Despite the hurried retreat to Union ground, he remained stationary, a man in a slit.
So you've done the Vietnam War, Korean War, Civil War. Is the Revolutionary War next? You're going to keep going back?
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's sort of an attractive place if you're looking for maximum personal and societal conflict. A war is the place. Why do war correspondents go to report from wars? That's where the stories are.
Ambition.
I guess so. Let's talk a little bit about craft. As an editor, I love talking about craft. Now, as you read the book, you'll see some chapters and characters have first-person narration, some have third-person, differing levels of that. Can you talk about that decision to where and how you put the camera?
Well, I've always seen Connolly as the central figure in the book, but everyone else, Dr. Story, the sharpshooter, Dervla, Weed, a child that Connolly meets at the asylum, they all have their own sections, and I would say that I do a very close third person because I'm trying to pull in the way each of them really perceives reality and what's around them. And the book sort of moves like this, kind of overlaying and overlaying and overlaying. And it's a wonderful way to write because there are so many secrets revealed all the way through the book. And I didn't really plan all of those secrets.
It sort of feels like an opera. Right, in a play, you can't all speak at the same time, but in opera, you can all sing at the same time and sing very different conflicting things. And by doing this third person point of view, you can have people speaking essentially at the same time over the same events, but no one else is necessarily hearing
And
that.
sometimes they're giving different versions of the same event, a kind of Rashomon.
Yeah.
And I love to see that in books because it really gets at perception and consciousness, which is kind of what I'm really, really interested in.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time. I want to just ask if you could share a bit with us about the process of writing this novel or a novel in general. How do you, each writer does it differently? Do you start with the one scene and work your way backwards? Do you have the end and then get there? How do you do it?
I never have the end, sadly. And I think it's been different for each book. I mean, for Shelter, I had written just a paragraph about being inside those cabins in this sort of wet summer heat, the girls having their rest. And I carried that paragraph around for about 20 years before I started writing the book. Lark and Termite, I was visiting my hometown. I looked out the window and saw this child sitting kind of facing this pebbled back alley, holding a dry cleaning bag up to his face and blowing on it continually. And he was sitting in a kind of 1950s lawn chair. And I said to my friend, "Who is that? And what is he doing?" She said, "I don't know, but he does that all day, every day."
Wow.
And then later, weirdly, I had a friend who was an artist, and she showed me a picture in her notebook that was a picture of him. That is, it was a sketch in which you saw it's in the book, it's in Lark and Termite, you see that sketch by Mary. And I was just blown away by that. And I started the book with Lark, his sister, saying that she's bringing him into the yard.
And what scene started this book?
The very
The one you read.
first, the journey.
So you didn't know where it was going to be, who was going to be
I knew they were
revealed?
going to the asylum, but she just began the book, and I was able to build on her voice, and I had to find out who these other characters were.
So you work backwards, figuring
Who
each of these
was
two-
Dervla?
Who's this dude brother? Who's this night watch? Who's the mother? Who's this random guy?
And it's also, the beginning is 1874, but there's a middle section of the book that's 1864. So you meet the characters, and then you go back 10 years to sort of see why they are as they are. And then it moves again then to 1874.
That's great. And it's always risky to move around in time, if we know, because readers can get lost, but if you give good, signposts along the way. So this is a really wonderful book, and I would love to open it to the audience for questions, including those of you out watching the live stream. You can type in your questions. If you have a question, just wave your hand and let someone come over with the microphone. While you're thinking of your questions, I wanted to ask you.
I usually plant someone, but I forgot.
Well, I'm going to ask you, though, what is next? I know you just got
what
this
is
book
next?
out, but what are you thinking about next?
Well, I'm working on a book of memoir and essays on writers and writing and origins, because people are so obsessed with origins.
And so that's interviewing writers who come from different places, let's see, or profiling them.
I've done a lot of writing about writing, and I'd like those to exist somewhere else than the internet. I've done a lot of memoirs, some of which I was sort of sent on, and it's like a collection. I'm not quite sure what form it's going to take, but it's a collection of strangely related, of course they're written by the same person, disparate pieces.
Well, that sounds exciting. Do you have a title yet?
I do.
Can you share it with us?
No
or is it-
way.
All right.
I think it's a great title.
Okay. Well, let me ask you how you got the title of this book.
That wasn't easy. I went through so many titles for this book. Gabby knows, right? The first title was Trans-Allegheny. Everyone hated that title. The second title was Moral Treatment. Everyone thought that was too grim. Once it was Connolly's Journey. And I love that William Trevor book, Felicia's Journey. But no one liked Connolly's Journey. And I wasn't that wild about it myself, because I wanted kind of something from the book. And somehow, we had thought about Night Watch early on, but we didn't use it because there have been so many books called Night Watchman, The Watchman. But the Night Watch is really the center of the book. I mean, he really is a man like he will never be seen again kind of thing. He's the moral fulcrum, really. And where does that come from? Oh, no spoilers. Where does that come from in a person, especially in someone who has had such a splattered, difficult past? How do they wind up that way? When you think about the painting, The Night Watchman, all of these men gathered together in this kind of, what looks like some kind of underground cavern, and they are each one the protectors of their cities. So there's just something very protective about this idea of the night watch.
Great. Questions from the audience? There's a number here. Well, wait for the microphone if you don't mind. Thanks.
Hi. I think Night Watch is a perfect title. I'm glad you landed there. Also because when I think of a night watch, I think of someone who's looking out for, right? Like taking care, like seeing what's going on. And I wanted to ask you, because your books obviously touch on war and the desolation, the destruction of war, but this is very much a story about love and care as well, as was Lark and Termite. If you could just talk a little about the other side, which is that sort of in the wake of this devastation, your novels are about people who care for each other and families that are built sort of around this destruction.
Well, I think there should someday be a huge headline in the New York Times, "Love Defies Death." Because it really does. When you think about, as I was saying, this was a country of 30 million people, and they lost 1.5 million. In addition, the generations, the widows and the children of all of these men and brothers and sons who didn't come back. Their psyches, what it did to their psyches, really affected the next 2 generations. Yet there is such love and protection between this mother and daughter, and certainly between Eliza, the mother's name, and the sharpshooter, as he's called. Something else that really runs through this book is namelessness. The sharpshooter's name changes according to what situation he's in. And his identity, well,
No spoilers.
no more, she says.
All right, thank you. You just pass it right behind you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm from West Virginia. Well, the 3 of us are here.
And John is.
Yeah. And, I'm drawn to that area, and I live in New York. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you're so drawn back to home, back to West Virginia in particular.
Well, I guess that's where my identity was formed, and I lived out a rural road, and we had this big concrete breezeway that originally was fenced while the kids were little, and we could see 3 fields and 2 hills and a farther hill where for some reason there was an abandoned school bus parked at the very top of the hill. And every summer we would take a hike to the school bus, I think that everything I learned, later I, of course, learned more, but my first definitions of everything came from there, both the good and the bad. So I think I don't always write what I know. I sometimes write what I don't know. But the sort of bedrock sense of the land, and if I'm in a different state like New Hampshire, even Massachusetts, and I'm on a certain type of road where the trees are hung over the road and it's a kind of 2-lane and there's no other cars, and I just feel as though it's the West Virginia world suddenly. So I don't know, it casts a spell.
Thank you. Is there a question up front, or are you just stretching? A question from back there. While you're thinking of your next question, I wanted to ask you, what has the role of literary magazines been in your life as a writer?
Oh, I think, especially as an emerging writer, it's absolutely so important. To see your work in print is very different than to see it in TypeScript. You suddenly feel as though you're real, and
do you remember the first literary magazine that you got published in?
The first literary magazine was a magazine called Truck.
See, everyone remembers their first.
No, that wasn't my first. No. It was EO.
EO.
IO, the Richard Grossinger magazine. That's where it was first published. But Truck Press published my first chapbook.
And what happened to your life after you got published in a literary magazine? Or how did it change you as a writer to see your work?
How did I what?
How did it change you as a writer to see your work in print?
It's just a wonderful thrill. You just feel as though I really feel that the reader helps read the book or the story, that the reader brings their own associations and their own fears or their own longing to a story or a book, even though the writer and the reader never meet. And I think you're very aware of that contract when you see your work in print. It takes me a very long time to write a novel, ridiculously long time. And I think I was working on this book for about 8 years.
That's a long way.
It's a long time. She does hers in 2, right? But I would get so kind of lonely to see that the book was real that sometimes I would publish a section of it in a magazine, so that there were sections published when the characters were very different than they ended up being.
So literary magazines for lonely hearts. A year ago, we had the good fortune of interviewing Edward Hirsch on this stage, and one thing Ed Hirsch said was that literary magazines tell us the news, right? They bring the news, because by the time we get to a book, these writers are established, but the news or the new writers or people you might never have heard of really come, and I think every writer can tell you that story. And not that I have an ulterior motive to push literary magazines, but to remind people, especially people who love to read, that it's not just books that we want to read, but also the literary magazines that bring the new writers. Every great writer.
Everyone should be subscribed to 6 literary magazines.
From the horse's mouth, right?
Across the spectrum.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, in BLR, we published a story, and I remember this so clearly. We were in an editorial meeting. One editor said, I have this really interesting story called Girls at Play by an unknown writer named Celeste Ng. And she pushed this story, like, I want to get this published. So we published it. And of course, her career took off. But many years later, when she's interviewed in the Times, she talked about she had just given birth and was in deep postpartum depression. And she said, I thought I would never write again. But then she got published in Bellevue Literary Review, and she got nominated for, and she won a Pushcart Prize for the Sun. And she's like, that was like, gave her like, oh, there is sun beyond the clouds. And of course, we were thrilled to know and to hear that, because that's what you want to be doing as a literary magazine or someone interested in health and healing. But
the writing is really, really hard. Some people enjoy it, I don't.
It is very hard.
But it's such a joy to finish the book. To know the book is done. It's just, it's wonderful. And as someone who taught writers for many years, I've seen so many students suddenly, well, not suddenly, but
feels like suddenly,
publish their own books.
Yes.
And that's just such a joy.
Yeah, it's like having grandchildren. We have just a minute or two. If there's a last question. Yes, on the front row. Hold on for the microphone.
You kind of just started to go here, but when you enter a book from this point where you don't know exactly where it's going, how do you know when it is done? How do you know when it's finished?
Question is, how do you know when the book is done?
Wow, you just know. Um, when you get to the last line, you'll know it's done. I don't know. It's a really kind of magical process, I think, in that way.
For some writers, other people agonize at the end because you do want to end.
Oh, I
on
agonized
that-
all the way through.
Okay.
Don't worry.
But you want to end on that one little note that just, and that which seems so not, when you read the book, it seems, oh, that's perfect. But of course, as the writer, you probably spend 50 hours on that little last phrase.
When you read the book, you'll see the way time moves all the way through, and then the way it moves at the end. So if you'd read the book, we could talk about what happens, but I don't want to spoil that for you.
Can I borrow your copy? Ladies and gentlemen, the book is Night Watch, up for the National Book Award. Get your copy. Thank you, Jayne and Phillips.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Danielle.
Thank you both so much. Yes, the books are over by the bookstore. Go get it and then come back in here and you can chat with Jayne and get it signed. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.